On May 25th, a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd was arrested on suspicion that he had used a counterfeit $20 bill. A Minneapolis police officer named Derek Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck while Floyd cried that he could not breathe. Floyd repeated this at least 16 times. He also warned Chauvin, "I'm about to die." Bystanders repeatedly asked the officers to stop and check on Floyd, who had fallen unconscious. After minutes of pleading, another officer checked Floyd's pulse and found none. The officers did not attempt to provide Floyd with medical assistance. Another officer asked Chauvin if they should move Floyd to his side. Chauvin refused. Eventually, paramedics were alerted, but after they arrived, Chauvin continued to keep his knee on Floyd's neck for another minute. Prosecutors have asserted that Chauvin kept his knee on Floyd's neck for 7 minutes and 46 seconds. George Floyd was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. In the wake of this extrajudicial killing, the people of Minneapolis, Minnesota staged massive demonstrations against the Minneapolis Police Department, citing a long history of over-policing, brutality, and targeting of people of color. Floyd's tragic passing was the spark that lit the flame, but his circumstances were not unique. Solidarity protests in other cities across the United States began to spring up, and in time, protests in other nations joined the movement. The police protect their own, and peaceful protests can be ignored by the media. People in the United States, particularly people of color, know from experience that the only way to create meaningful change is to force the issue, and so the protests evolved into what the media commonly calls riots. The usage of the word riot has a specific meaning in the media, among politicians, and among the police. A riot is an uprising of people of color or the poor. A white militia or an armed neo-fascist group marching through the streets to intimidate people of color is never labeled a riot because the violence of this intimidation is not immediately physical. It is an invisible violence, a more passive societal violence, like barbed wire atop a wall. It is there to intimidate, to tell others to stay down where they belong, and if they attempt to scale the wall and cut themselves on the wire, it is the fault of those below for trying. The police launching tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters, even peaceful protesters, is also not labeled a riot. The police, even when more physically violent than those they are accusing of violence, are never labeled as rioting, and their violence is not labeled as violence. It is euphemistically called maintaining order or quelling a disturbance. When people of color angrily protest their mistreatment by the state, it can be labeled a riot even if the only violence perpetrated is against windows, trash cans, and other inanimate objects. Thus, labeling an event a riot does not occur once some threshold of physical violence is reached. If people of color can burn an automobile and have it be labeled a riot, but the police can be physically violent to human beings and not have it be labeled a riot. No, the common denominator in what is and is not labeled a riot is not physical violence, but the involvement of people of color as the aggrieved party. Labeling an event a riot almost always occurs due to who is involved, due to who is protesting whom. The other difference between riots following police brutality and state-endorsed violence, whether passive or physical, is that the former is fighting against oppression and the latter is fighting for oppression. These actions are not equal and are in fact opposites. Many white Americans, those for whom this oppression does not exist, prefer an orderly absence of justice over a disorderly cry for justice. They say, "You don't see white people in the suburbs breaking windows." This ignores the fact that white people in the suburbs do not have any reason for an uprising. They do not share the same concerns or have the same problems as people of color or the poor. They say, there is no justification for violence. This ignores the fact that people of color and the poor are far more likely to be the victims of state violence than white people or the wealthy. It also ignores the fact that the label of violence is something enforced by the state and the media. They say, the looting proves this is about stealing, not justice. This ignores the fact that the aggrieved party in a riot may have been incited by a particular incident, but their long-standing grievances with the state include the maintenance of their poverty. All these arguments will be interrogated in greater detail later. So, why do the poor rise up? Why do people of color riot in the United States? Riots occur when all other attempts at reaching a peaceful solution have failed. Riots occur when a group of people have been oppressed both too much and for too long, with so few consequences to those performing this oppression. A riot is not a failure of society. Instead, the failure of society is what causes a riot. To better understand the specific grievances, some history will be necessary. A history of racial oppression, poverty, and how poverty itself has been racialized. As an ideology, white supremacy is the belief that white people are either genetically or culturally superior to people of color, and that white people ought to maintain a socio-economic hierarchy with themselves at the top. However, white supremacy is also a system in which an exploitable people is maintained through the state, either by de facto or de jure implementation of policy favoring white people. Due to power dynamics, racist ideas do not travel most effectively upwards to the ruling class, but most effectively downwards from the ruling class, thus mainstreaming racist ideas among the wider population and acceptance of racist policies among the wider population. According to Ibram X. Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning, this is the causal relationship driving America's history of race relations. Their own racist ideas usually do not dictate the decisions of the most powerful Americans when they instituted, defended, and tolerated discriminatory policies that affected millions of black lives over the course of American history. Racially discriminatory policies have usually sprung from economic, political, and cultural self-interests that are constantly changing. Politicians seeking higher office have primarily created and defended discriminatory policies out of political self-interest, not racist ideas. Capitalists seeking to increase profit margins have primarily created and defended discriminatory policies out of economic self-interest, not racist ideas. In short, the ruling class do not maintain an exploitable people because they, by coincidence, happen to believe in racist ideas, but because the maintenance of an exploitable people benefits them. White supremacy does not happen in secret, it happens out in the open. However, it can be denied as if it were secret, by claiming it does not exist, by claiming that any ill effects of the interrelated social and economic systems that form white supremacy are the fault of people of color, rather than the fault of those with greater control over said systems. Example: white supremacy limited black Americans' access to the suburbs in the 1950s and forced them to continue living in crowded cities, while white Americans were allowed to move to the suburbs, if they also met the other condition of having money. These moneyed white people left, which meant there was less money in the cities and also less white people. Less money often means more crime in order to survive. White supremacy caused this change in racial and economic demographics of cities, but white supremacy also tells people to ignore white supremacy and draw the false conclusions of racist ideas, that people of color cause poverty and crime. This is only one example. White supremacy takes different shapes and molds different policies, but it also adapts to the same goal: exploitation of people of color by instituting a form of racialized poverty through public policy, all while socially othering people of color so that there can be no solidarity among the poor economic class. Poverty is necessary in order for capitalism to function. There must be a significantly larger number of working poor in order to sustain the rich. Not everyone can be too poor, or else nobody could be the active consumers that the wealthy need there to be. That is where the middle class comes in, the predominantly white middle class that is content in their modest stability and whiteness. In short, white supremacy is not simply a collective of hate groups, it is a system of exploitation. The history of the maintenance of white supremacy as a means of exploitation is long and bloody, particularly in the United States. The first and most infamous form of white supremacy that took shape in the United States was slavery. Although slavery existed long before the discovery of the New World, the Atlantic slave trade had a scale and a lasting legacy that dwarfs other historical institutions of slavery. The Atlantic slave trade lasted from the 15th to 19th century, and brought approximately 10 million Africans to North and South America. This number does not, however, factor in all the Africans who died during capture. Slavery was deemed necessary by European colonists to properly grow the economies in the colonies. With not enough indentured servants available or enough paid laborers willing to perform the intensive work related to sugar, tobacco, and cotton, the wealthy created an exploitable class in the New World. Slaves being ethnically different from the class who bought them benefited the owners in another way. The othering of slaves as a different people resulted in fewer benefactors and defenders. This othering was maintained through propaganda that marked the exploitable people as either inferior by blood or chosen by God to be servile. With slavery an acceptable practice and the flow of crops at this level now standard, abolition of slavery faced obstacles of economic interests among the ruling class and limited pushback among poor whites. The eventual abolition of slavery was not the end result of white politicians gifting freedom to a long-exploited people. This ahistorical propaganda was designed to recast the wealthy white ruling class as the saviors of Africans instead of their exploiters. Abolition was the result of active resistance, including but not limited to riots in opposition to slavery. Africans often took control of slave ships. Approximately 1 out of 10 slave ships was subject to rebellion, a riot in a limited space. Slave rebellions were common in the United States, Jamaica, and Haiti, the last of which evolved into a successful revolution. Slaves in the United States also successfully escaped, successfully fought back against their masters, and successfully served in the Civil War, killing a great number of Confederate soldiers. Abolition of slavery was not handed down by Abraham Lincoln. It was demanded and fought for until there was no choice but to acknowledge centuries of inhumane treatment, or else face even more physical violence, war, and rebellion. Though it may seem paradoxical, rare historical instances of good governance required the people to be ungovernable. And so, this form of white supremacy was forced to adapt to maintain now free Black Americans as an exploitable people. This was accomplished in several ways, all of which had economic interests. Following abolition, capitalists feared an emerging class unity between poor black and poor white workers. A unity among the labor class, regardless of race and other factors, is strong enough to collectivize and oppose their own exploitation by capitalists. Capitalists, especially Southern plantation owners, presented the idea to poor white workers that they could not trust newly freed poor black workers due to how recent slavery was and lasting resentment over it. White plantation owners built a political coalition with poor white workers to overthrow integrated Reconstruction governments throughout the South. Rather than joining forces with poor black workers to organize against their mutual exploitation under capitalism, poor white workers sided with rich white plantation owners, choosing racism over class solidarity. In Black Reconstruction in America, W.E.B. Du Bois said of this, "It was not, then, race and culture calling out of the South in 1876. It was property and privilege, shrieking to its own kind, and privilege and property heard and recognized the voice of its own. White Americans organized themselves into vigilante gangs, undermined free elections that would benefit former slaves, terrorized black leaders, and spread propaganda that these actions were not the fault of white Americans who wielded power, but the fault of black Americans who wielded none. Black Americans understandably armed themselves, but their self-defense was labeled the actual violence by white Americans. This would become a pattern well into the 21st century, as black communities protesting state violence is invariably labeled the real violence because it is done more visibly, more dramatically, without a badge and without the protection of whiteness. It should have been obvious that poor black workers and poor white workers had a lot more in common than poor white workers and rich white capitalists, but the ruling class has greater access to the political system and to propaganda. Centuries of othering African slaves as socially and genetically different to justify slavery had an added benefit for capitalists. That being that should slaves ever gain their freedom, they would still be seen as distinct from whites, and therefore more easily exploited for their labor. Thus, the intersection of race and poverty presented black workers with greater challenges than white workers, creating a racialized poverty even during Reconstruction. This intentional racialized poverty fit neatly into exploiting black Americans in two ways. First, as workers who could be underpaid due to the lack of institutional support, and second, as prisoners. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States abolished slavery, except for anyone convicted of a crime. Prisoners could still be punished through forced unpaid labor. This labor was generally work required by the state or by the wealthy that needed to be done inexpensively. In the book The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander wrote, "We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. Poverty creates criminogenic conditions, circumstances and settings that encourage or even require people to perform actions outside the law in order to survive. In the late 19th century, much of the black population of the United States was in poverty due to only recently being freed and the aforementioned sabotage during Reconstruction. Police were more able to arrest black Americans for minor infractions or under false pretenses. White abolitionists thought that with the end of slavery, enough had been done for black Americans, and now they were on their own. In short, both criminogenic conditions and the social dynamics of white supremacy helped populate prisons with free labor, black labor. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution abolished slavery only as the former chattel institution, but maintained slavery in another name. White supremacy is adaptable. It's able to reconfigure itself to be more palatable, more socially acceptable, but still approximately as profitable to the ruling class. Being black was criminalized in the United States, not on paper but in practice. Not through legal writ, but through a social pact among white Americans. White supremacy is not only enforced by law, but through social contract, by consistently reproving to black Americans through lynchings and mob actions that there are no consequences for mistreating and terrorizing them if these extrajudicial actions are performed by white Americans. An exploding prison population of black Americans was not seen as exploitation through the eyes of white Americans, but as the natural outcome of their behavior that society had told them was criminal. Historically, prison does not reform people. It only teaches prisoners how to become better criminals. Some who were wrongfully convicted became actual criminals following their sentences due to the limited options afforded to ex-convicts, limited resources following years of being separated from the rest of the world, and the psychological trauma of prison itself that leaves many people unable to adapt or too traumatized to live a normal life. Recidivism is not a bug, but a feature for the exploiters, the capitalists, the white politicians. This exploitation is not only history, not only the past, it is the present. Incarceration exploded in the 1990s, following a crime bill that scholars now believe disproportionately targeted black Americans. Today, black Americans are overrepresented in the country's prison population. In 2018, black Americans made up roughly 33% of the country's prison population, which does not sound too high until you factor in that black Americans only make up 12% of the total population of the United States. White inmates, by contrast, made up 30% of the prison population. Yet white Americans are 60% of the country's total population. Apologists for white supremacy state that maybe black Americans just commit more crimes. But even when the rate of the crime is the same between black and white Americans, black Americans are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be convicted, and receive harsher punishments than white Americans. For example, approximately 18% of black people over the age of 12 in 2018 reported using marijuana within the past year, while 17% of white people over the age of 12 reported the same. Nearly identical. Yet, that same year, black Americans were arrested 360% more often than white Americans for possession of marijuana. White supremacy in the United States, the system, not the ideology, is sometimes given a more palatable term: systemic racism. This phrase dulls the perception of the system, making it appear less inflammatory. Nevertheless, even this more benign term is loudly rejected by those who wish to ignore white supremacy. This defensiveness is often called white fragility. It often manifests in white Americans saying something like, "White people and black people have been equal under the law since the Civil Rights Act. That means there is no systemic racism, only individual racists." This ignores three important facts. First, racist ideas do not form in a vacuum. A racist does not become a racist without being influenced by a society that told the racist these racist ideas, and encouraged these ideas by showing there are few consequences to having them. Racism is a pattern, not something that appears within a person out of thin air. For example, there is a reason why widely held stereotypes exist. They are not conjured up independently within an individual, but collectively as a society. A false common knowledge that is passed on. Second, laws can disproportionately affect a group of people, even if the language of the law does not state that is the intention. In the same way a racist can be a racist without admitting they are a racist, a law can have racist consequences even if its language does not explicitly cite a race. One infamous example of this was the different prison sentences for possession of powder cocaine and crack cocaine. The former being popular among white Americans and receiving a lesser sentence, and the latter being more popular among black Americans and receiving a greater sentence. And third, laws can also disproportionately affect a group of people through intentional over-policing of particular cities or particular areas of the cities that contain a high population of Black Americans. This is where a lot of the disparity comes from. In short, statistics about different treatment of Black Americans and white Americans prove that racism, in this case white supremacy, is a pattern, not some individual failing. Systemic racism is not only laws that disproportionately affect people of color, or a cultural pattern of behavior that negatively affects people of color. Systemic racism is also a cultural pattern of behavior that tends to supersede the laws, so that no matter how neutral or benign a law might seem to be, the law can be weaponized against people of color to uphold white supremacy. Racists tend to dismiss the concept of systemic racism because its existence disproves one of their two mutually exclusive beliefs. Either that racism barely exists nowadays and that people of color are only playing the race card, or that people of color are inherently predisposed to criminality and that the statistics prove that instead. To believe in the first concept, one would have to assume that the undeniable pattern of systemic racism is merely coincidental or a series of statistical anomalies. But considering how astronomically unlikely that is, not to mention that these statistics relate to institutions that are independent of one another but still show the same pattern, the very idea that this is some big coincidence or rounding error is embarrassingly ludicrous. To believe the second concept, racists paradoxically dismiss this unassailable pattern of systemic racism by adopting an even more overtly racist posture, harking back to long disproved pseudoscience about genetic inferiority and 19th century hogwash about non-whites being inherently predisposed to criminality, laziness, or other negative attributes. In other words, there really is no avoiding the math without adopting phony science, and since the science is phony, we are left with the math. People are not treated equally under the law, even if the law itself bears no mention of inequality. For example, the rich and famous are far more likely to get away with their crimes or suffer limited consequences compared to the poor. This is something white people generally know based on their own experiences with authority and own knowledge of how wealth and power work in the United States. However, applying this same metric, this same power dynamic to race, is harder to admit, even though the same invisible power dynamics exist between the rich and poor as they do between the racial majority and racial minority. Now, how is this exploitation enforced? Politicians condemn white supremacy only by condemning unpopular hate groups, all the while enacting policies that enforce white supremacy. The modern police force that we know today is a fairly recent invention. Until the 19th century, policing in the United States took many forms but was not as centralized or well-armed. There was nothing related to actual crime in the United States that necessitated this change. Cities were growing and there were anecdotal accounts of increasing vice in urban environments, but there is no significant evidence of a crime wave. What was happening in the 19th century was the emergence of the labor movement in response to exploitation under the evolving system of capitalism. Workers demanded greater pay and consideration, sometimes leading to demonstrations against wealthy capitalists. Riots as a means of demanding better treatment. The police are said to exist to maintain order and correct disorder, but we have to understand who is defining these terms. In the cities of the 19th century United States, disorder was defined by capitalists. Capitalists needed a method in which to ensure the control of their workforce. They supported the creation of an armed, centralized police force to protect their interests. Policing in the North was modified from the old watch system, and policing in the South was modified from slave patrols. These patrols chased down, apprehended, and returned slaves to their owners, but they also created an atmosphere of terror to deter slave rebellions or slave riots. In short, modern policing began as a means of opposing emerging unions and workers' rights, protecting property, controlling people as property, and protecting the state from unrest by the workers. To put it more bluntly, the modern police exist to control the poor. The police exist because of capitalism. Capitalism operates through wage labor. A worker sells their labor for a wage that is far less than what the owner earns from that labor. For example, a wage laborer in a bakery makes several loaves of bread so that he can afford only one slice of bread. Under capitalism, the wealthy grow richer, but their workers do not, Instead, capitalists hire more workers at roughly the same wages, put some of the capitalists' earnings back into production, grow richer still, and repeat the process. By doing this, capitalists continue to accumulate wealth while the workers, the poor and middle class, do not. This is the aforementioned exploitation, but under capitalism, this is not only tolerated but encouraged. Exploitation is not the result of cheating capitalism, but the result of adhering to capitalism. Now, combine this exploitive economic system with the modern centralized police to enforce it, and combine that with a pre-established, historically exploited group that has been kept relatively poor through racialized poverty, and you have over-policing. Harassment of people of color through broken windows policies, stop and frisk, questioning people of color if they cross an invisible barrier between downtown and uptown, and of course, state violence. The ruling capitalist class maintains a lower wage labor class that is dependent on capitalists, and a convict labor class that will work for practically nothing. Now let's go through these policing tactics individually. Broken windows policing is a strategy that targets low-level infractions and deals with them through disproportionate aggression, punishments, and violence. This is justified through a theory put forth by two criminologists in the 1980s, James Q. Wilson and George Kelling. According to Alex S. Vitale, author of The End of Policing, they presented existing behavioral research that showed that when a car is left unattended on a street, it is usually left alone, but if just one window of the car is broken, the car is quickly vandalized. The lesson: failure to indicate care and maintenance will unleash people's latent destructive tendencies. Therefore, if cities want to establish or maintain crime-free neighborhoods, they must take action to ensure that residents feel the pressure to conform to civilized norms of public behavior. The broken windows theory reverses the well-understood causal relationship between crime and poverty, claiming that poverty is the result of crime, not the cause. This theory, though widely debunked, is the position of white supremacy. It is not in the interests of the wealthy and predominantly white elites to admit that disparity is the problem, because they are the ones who benefit most from this disparity. So, those in power blame the victims of white supremacy and of capitalism, rather than the perpetrators. Next is police harassment through unnecessary stops and searches. This is common practice in the United States, and sometimes it is formalized through specific initiatives, such as the infamous New York City stop and frisk policy under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Stop and frisk is a strategy that allows police officers to detain someone for questioning on the street, in public housing projects, or in private buildings where landlords request police patrols. Officers are required to have a reasonable belief that the person is, has been, or is about to be involved in a crime. However, that determination is made entirely by the police officer in question. If police officers believe that the detainee is armed, an officer can conduct a frisk by passing his hands over the person's outer garments. However, once again, this determination about whether or not the person on the street is armed is made by the police officer. Police can always claim that a target is making furtive movements. This is a loosely defined term that encapsulates roughly any type of behavior, including but not limited to looking over one's shoulder. All of this means that limitations for the police often only exist in theory, not in practice. This harassment disproportionately affects people of color. Apologists for this police harassment of people of color often claim it is a necessity, citing black-on-black crime. The truth is that anyone is more likely to be harmed by someone who lives near them, and since black communities and white communities are fairly well segregated, the most likely perpetrator of a black victim is also black, but the most likely perpetrator of a white victim is also white. Nobody ever shouts white-on-white crime, but it is just as true. Next, this history of segregation and redlining has created circumstances in which people of color are stopped by police officers if they are seen in a white neighborhood, even if they live there. Police are stationed across the roads leading from so-called good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods. They are the enforcers of this segregation, with the goal of keeping the white consumer class happy and content, safe in the knowledge that the other is being contained downtown. Finally, there is police violence. Apologists for white supremacy will always mention that most who are killed by the police in the United States are white because there are more white people in the nation, but that does not take into account this inconvenient statistic. In 2020, so far, more than 1,000 people have been killed by the police in the United States. 28% of the victims have been black. That might sound like a small amount until you take into consideration that black Americans only make up 13% of the US population. So that's more than double where it would be if all things were equal. Perhaps even more importantly, Black Americans are roughly 3 times more likely to be killed during encounters with the police, despite the fact that during these encounters, Black Americans are roughly 1.5 times more likely to be unarmed than white Americans. In other words, less likely to pose a threat, but far more likely to be killed. Apologists for white supremacy claim Black communities are just where the police are. However, statistics consistently show that levels of violent crime in U.S. cities do not determine rates of police violence. It is demonstrably untrue that police violence is simply an unavoidable result of a comparable violent crime rate. There is simply no way to fudge the numbers so much that racism becomes a negligible factor into encounters between the police and Black Americans. Furthermore, the most egregious acts of state violence against Americans throughout the 20th century and 21st century have been against Black Americans, not white Americans. In 1985, a police helicopter dropped a bomb on a Black left-wing group. 11 people were killed, including 5 children. 61 homes were destroyed, leaving more than 250 citizens homeless. The police generally do not drop bombs on gatherings that are almost exclusively white and almost exclusively right-wing. These are only a handful of examples, but the long and short of it is that state violence is targeted. It is not some neutral force of nature. It should be noted that the poor are not the only victims of capitalism, but they are the most aggrieved victims. Black Americans are not the only victims of state violence, but they are the most aggrieved victims. Because poverty is racialized in the United States, uprisings by poor people of color are a reflection of the failures of capitalism and the state. Uprisings occur when the material conditions of the people have been destroyed and the dignity of the people has been stolen. When everything else has failed, the people conclude, often spontaneously, that they have no choice but to demand better treatment through their last resort. Conservative pundits and white liberals always say the same thing. Why don't they work within the system? It displays the privileged perspective of someone for whom the system actually is working, instead of trying to share the perspective of a people for whom the system historically has not worked. It is unreasonable to tell people who have tried everything else to keep trying what has failed. The truth is, some form of civil disobedience has often been necessary to force social change throughout the course of history. Demands for civility function primarily to stifle the frustrations, outcries, protests, and declarations of grievances of those currently facing hardships, in this case predominantly Black communities faced with state violence. Civility seems like a kind of neutrality, and because of this, those enjoying the status quo call for it, because civility maintains this status quo, whereas incivility seeks to change it. There is a reason why people who have already got theirs call for civility atop their high horses, whereas people who have less cannot simply accept that this is as good as it will ever be. Civility is a tactic to suppress protest and to falsely claim that both sides share equal blame for the unequal relationship of white supremacy. When there is unrest in a Black community, white conservatives and white liberals join forces to invoke the memory of Martin Luther King Jr., appropriating his message and legacy from the very people he sought to help. Whites use King to scold and finger-wag Black communities, yet the image of King that white conservatives and liberals conjure up is completely false. King himself went to jail dozens of times. Breaking the law was necessary because the civility of working within the system provided few outlets for effecting significant change. King himself said, "A riot is the language of the unheard, and what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity." A fantasy of white liberals specifically is that King alone changed the course of history with a single speech and a half-remembered march. But the civil rights movement was also won through the actions of Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, and a great many others who had more aggressive tactics. The Civil Rights Act was not won through civility, it was won by consistently breaking the law. Cries for civility are often in bad faith. Believers in the status quo say, "Protest state violence peacefully," and then when they do protest peacefully, that is denounced too. There is no form of protest against state violence that will truly satisfy those who benefit from this violence. It's a con, a way of shaping the conversation to always suit the interests of white supremacy. So, what do those who rise up actually want? What are they hoping to accomplish through direct confrontation with the police? Although such a confrontation generally happens spontaneously, it does not happen without a causal action. That is almost always state violence against black communities. This means that even without organization, this confrontation has the goal of accountability, and that only happens when it is demanded. Christian Williams, author of Our Enemies in Blue, Power and Police in America, once wrote, "The battles that ensue do not only concern particular injustices, but also represent deep disputes about the rights of the public and the limits of state power. On the one side, the police and the government try desperately to maintain control, to preserve their authority, and on the other, oppressed people struggle to assert their humanity. Such riots represent, among other things, the attempt of the community to define for itself what will count as police brutality and where the limit of authority falls. It is in these conflicts, not in the courts, that our rights are established." In general, police officers do not suffer serious consequences following shooting, choking, and otherwise brutalizing civilians. Several steps have to be taken for there to be anything even resembling accountability. First, the incident must be recorded. Second, the recording must go viral on the internet. Third, this viral video must then be picked up by mainstream news outlets. Fourth, there must be a national outcry, not only local outcry. It must be so loud and sustained that it cannot be ignored by those in power in the city in which the incident occurred. Fifth, there must be citywide protests to sustain this outrage, and solidarity protests in other cities so that the news media understands this to be a national story and not a local story. Despite these first 5 hurdles towards accountability, the police officer in question is still usually safe, and that means a 6th step will often be taken: confrontation with the police. As uncomfortable as this might make us, riots sometimes affect real change and create real accountability for a police officer. When Johannes Messerly killed Oscar Grant, it was the uprising that convinced the state to take action against the officer. The general consensus was that the only reason Messerly was even arrested was because the people rioted. The riot and the threat of future riots convinced the state to charge Messerly, although only for involuntary manslaughter. Those who oppose these uprisings cite the property damage, but that property damage is part of the protest. The riots against Messerly caused damage and added expenses to the city for weeks of added police protection. To the state, Messerly's greatest crime was not shooting an unarmed black man. It was costing the city money. The police exist to protect property, generally white property, and a police officer who threatens this property has failed in his one job. And what of this property damage anyway? Vicky Ostervale, author of In Defense of Looting, wrote, "The 'why do you destroy your own neighborhoods' trope emerged in force during the dozens of uprisings in cities across the United States during the 60s. Here we see a willful confusion of geography and power. Though the buildings destroyed may be located in a predominantly black or proletarian neighborhood, the losses go to the white bourgeois building and business owners, rarely the people who live near them. As a Ferguson rioter put in a viral Instagram video, 'People want to say we're destroying our own neighborhoods. We don't own nothing out here.' This could be said of most majority black neighborhoods in America, which have much higher concentrations of chain stores and fast food restaurants than non-black neighborhoods. Those who oppose these uprisings then take it one step further, saying that participants are burning down cities. Although fires are not uncommon during these confrontations, such damage is nowhere near as sensational as all that. In the wake of the George Floyd uprisings in 2020, the cities still stand, and very little has been burned down, except for what the community has decided it does not want: a police station, police cars, a construction yard for a new prison, a symbol of capitalism and low wages, a symbol of white supremacy, etc. Occasionally, other structures catch fire, but these are rare and usually unintentional. Black people are not burning down their own cities. The only black city that was ever truly burned to the ground in the last 100 years was when white supremacists burned Tulsa to the ground in 1921. It is true that people can be harmed during these confrontations, but generally speaking, the people who are harmed during riots are the participants, suffering injury from further state violence from a militarized police force that is anxious to test out their new hardware, proving the point of the riot in the first place. Participants in the riots are not marching down the streets looking to harm innocent people. It is the participants who are harmed. who take the risk of being harmed for a greater cause. The most significant civilian violence during riots come from roaming white vigilantes. The uprising's participants themselves are not the primary aggressors of this violence. That violence comes from those opposing the uprising, armed to the teeth, more concerned with protecting white property than bringing attention to the loss of black lives. Those who oppose these uprisings engage in bad faith arguments with the participants, falsely claiming that they agree with the participants' complaints, but that going about it this way will hurt their cause. However, without the uprising, their cause would not be known at all. The uprising will divide the nation on whether or not it should be happening, yes, but the nation would not even have the opportunity to form an opinion on the cause unless the uprising happened in the first place. The national media does not often cover candlelight vigils. It covers action. One positive side effect is that the coverage of the 2020 protests and riots has moved the Overton window to the point that police abolition and phrases like defund the police are discussed in the mainstream rather than being fringe talking points like they were before. In other words, the uprisings have helped the cause far more than they have hurt the cause. Another bad faith argument against the uprisings is that this will lead to an escalation of state violence, not a diminishing of state violence. A fantasy about good behavior in black communities equaling good treatment in black communities. This ignores the fact that police already kill black children for holding toys and black women for sleeping in an apartment of an alleged criminal. Compliance with the police does not do much, if anything, to guarantee a decrease in state violence. Unfortunately, with this media coverage comes mischaracterization from conservative media. One mischaracterization is that black communities are content enough with the status quo and that the riots only exist due to the influence of mysterious outside agitators. This is a lie. Again, from Vicky Ostervale. The myth of outside agitators is used by conservatives and nonviolence champions alike to discredit militancy wherever it appears. This one is a white supremacist classic, going all the way back to slavery. The completely racist assumptions at the base of this argument, happy dumb slaves duped into believing they are human beings by scheming northerners, still forms the logic behind the outside agitator, a phrase that emerged in force during the civil rights movement. These days, white anarchists, George Soros and the employees of his organization, Antifa, or agent provocateurs, are likely to be the preferred outside agitating boogeymen. This logic strips those who protest of their power, claiming that their experiences, lives, and desires are not actually sufficient to inspire their acts of resistance. Another way conservative media tries to reframe the narrative of the uprising is to claim that this is only an excuse for looting. Yes, some participants take the opportunity to improve their financial situations by capturing money and property from corporations and chain department stores that offered the community only low wages. Participants in this militant action cannot loot more than has already been stolen from them. Considering how often the police kill civilians, the fact that there are only a few uprisings, a few outrages, a few riots per year shows incredible restraint. This is more evidence that a riot only occurs when all the other options have been exhausted, and when the conditions are so bad that nothing else will suffice. Obviously, riots are not perfect solutions to problems, which means that if we want to stop riots, we have to stop the conditions that have consistently created riots in the United States: poverty, state violence, and white supremacy. The biggest problems with riots are not the riots themselves, but the conditions that lead to them. In terms of poverty, we could raise the minimum wage to a living wage, pass universal health care, cancel debt, and investigate other factors that could reduce hardships. Opponents will say, where would we find the money? As if the United States is not the richest nation in the world, and as if other less rich nations have not enacted similar programs. We can do it because much of it has already been done elsewhere successfully. In terms of state violence, the police could be defunded with resources reallocated toward replacing what the police do, namely responding to incidents in which they have no business responding. Opponents say this is too radical and that we need to find a compromise, but defunding the police is not the radical proposal or the goal. Abolition of the modern centralized police is the goal, at least in my ideology. Defunding, demilitarizing, and reallocating is the compromise. It is the hope that solving these two conditions will at least help solve the third condition, white supremacy. Let's be clear. Combating protests against state violence with more state violence will not stop future riots. It never has in the past, and there is no reason to believe it will in the future. At best, an escalation of state violence will quell this riot, eventually, but spawn far more riots in the future. We know this is true because we have seen what has happened in 2020. The largest scale worldwide protests and riots in recorded history stemming from a single incident, in this case the death of George Floyd. Trying to stop riots after they have already begun does not prevent future riots. Actual solutions to the existing conditions must be investigated instead. The only conclusion for why these conditions have not been addressed is that people in power, from the politicians to the police, don't want them to be addressed. We have to force the issue. They don't protect us. We protect each other.